Hello, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching another episode of Explained. And in a dramatic shift in global energy politics, the United States has signalled a significant change in its stance towards India and Venezuelan oil. Last year, the US threatened India with tariffs for purchasing oil from Venezuela, but now sources say Washington has given India the green light to resume these imports, allowing the country to replace some of its Russian oil imports. This comes after India pledged to cut back on Russian oil following US tariffs that were imposed on those purchases as well. Indian oil imports from Russia have been steadily declining, with a significant reduction expected in the coming months. In fact, India's Russian oil imports were around 1.2 million barrels per day in January, but these are expected to fall to 800,000 per day by March, and they could eventually dip as low as 500,000 to 600,000 barrels per day. India's pivot away from Russian oil has been part of a broader strategy to diversify its energy sources, including turning to countries across the Middle East, Africa, and South America. As India reduces its Russian oil imports, state-run refiners like Hindustan Petroleum and Mangalore Refinery have already stopped buying Russian crude. Even private refiner Reliance Industries, which operates the world's largest refining complex, has committed to buying up 150,000 barrels per day of Russian oil starting from this very month. The US has been pressing for alternatives to Russian oil, and Venezuela's vast oil reserves present an opportunity. However, it's still unclear whether this Venezuelan oil will come directly from the state-owned PDVSA or be brokered through international trading houses like Vitol or Trafigura. What's certain is that the US is keen to secure Venezuelan crude for India as part of an extended geopolitical effort to reduce Russia's oil revenue, which it claims is being used to fund its war in Ukraine. While US officials are tight-lipped on the details, and both the White House and the US Treasury declined to comment, India's move to cut Russian imports is a strategic play. It aligns with its renewed interests, especially as New Delhi seeks to strengthen ties with Washington while navigating its complex energy needs. Now, as India's oil strategy begins shifting, the US is also reaching out to other major global players. US President Donald Trump has recently said that he would welcome Chinese investment in Venezuela's oil industry. Let's listen in to his comments.
I don't know anything about that, but I'll tell you what, China is welcome to come in and would make a great deal in oil. You know, we welcome China. We've already made a deal. India's coming in, and they're going to be buying Venezuelan oil as opposed to buying it from Iran. So we've already made that deal, the concept of the deal. But China's welcome to come in and buy oil.
Trump's comments come in the backdrop of Venezuela seeking to revive its battered economy after the forced ouster of former leader Nicolas Maduro. Now Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, and this week it even reformed laws to open its oil sector to private and foreign investment. Speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, Trump has stressed that the United States and Venezuela will share in future oil profits and that relations with Venezuela's leadership are very good. Moreover, according to the US president, Washington expects to sell a lot of Venezuelan oil, noting both the US and partners like China and India will benefit financially. His remarks point out to the growing role of Venezuela in global energy markets, which has suffered years of sanctions and declining production. Reports say, although China had been the dominant buyer of Venezuelan oil under Mr. Maduro, Beijing's exact future role has become uncertain after his capture. As the US continues to adjust its approach to Venezuela's oil, the diplomatic effort also takes center stage. Last week, on January the 28th, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly, for the very first time since the capture of Maduro earlier this month. Rubio confirmed that the US government is not considering further military action in Venezuela, leaning more towards peaceful diplomacy. But Rubio has emphasized that President Trump has not ruled out military options if necessary. But for now, the US military presence in Venezuela will reportedly remain limited to Marine Guards at the embassy. Additionally, Rubio has described recent communications with Venezuela's leadership as, quote, very respectful and productive, and has hinted that the US could soon reopen its embassy in Caracas after a previous shutdown in 2019. Let's listen in to some of his comments.
And we think very quickly we'll be able to open a U.S. diplomatic presence on the ground, which will allow us to have real-time information and interact, by the way, not just with officials in the regime and with the interim authorities, but also interact with members of civil society, the opposition. We've established what I think so far has been a very respectful and productive line of communication as we go through this stabilization phase and towards the recovery phase. But there's a lot of work to be done here. On the third point of use of force, look, the president never rules out his options as commander-in-chief to protect the national interest of the United States. I can tell you right now with full certainty, we are not postured to, nor do we intend or expect to have to take any military action in Venezuela at any time. The only military presence you'll see in Venezuela is our Marine Guards at an embassy.
However, there are still concerns within the US government. Some lawmakers, particularly Democrats, have raised alarms about the financial risks tied to investments in Venezuela. There's also a lot of skepticism about whether the US will be able to maintain control over Venezuela's oil revenues long term, especially if we take into account the country's history with socialist leadership. In the meantime, Rubio has noted that Venezuela's vast oil reserves remain a central focus for the US, but he has also said that Washington's ultimate goal is to help the country transition to a, quote, friendly, stable, prosperous Venezuela that will hold free and fair elections in the future. Now, as the US and Venezuela inch closer to a new economic chapter, Venezuela's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, has taken a historic step this week. On January the 29th, Interim President Rodriguez signed a sweeping reform to Venezuela's oil laws, opening the door for both private and foreign investment in the country's vast oil industry. This move follows a phone call from US President Donald Trump, who announced that restrictions on Venezuela's commercial airspace would now be lifted, improving relations between Venezuela and the US further. Let's listen in to Rodriguez's comments.
Esta ley nos permite el verdadero salto histórico, cualitativo, para convertir esas reservas de petróleo, las más grandes del planeta, que se convierta en la felicidad más grande del planeta que pueda tener un pueblo y que sea el pueblo venezolano el titular. Yo quiero informar que el día de hoy recibí una llamada del presidente de los Estados Unidos, Donald Trump, y de su secretario de Estado, Marco Rubio, donde se informa que en el marco de la agenda de trabajo de la cual hemos conversado y hablado, estamos dando pasos importantes.
Let's now look at the new law approved by Venezuela's National Assembly. It aims to reduce taxes, grant more autonomy to private producers, and at the same time enable asset transfers and service outsourcing. The Venezuelan interim government says that it's expected to boost oil and gas production as well as foreign investment. It is important to note that all of these developments come in the wake of Trump announcing a $100 billion reconstruction plan for Venezuela's oil sector. Rodriguez says that the new bill marks a huge shift after decades of strict nationalization, where foreign oil companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips had their assets expropriated. Now private companies can operate under new contracts or joint ventures, even as minority stakeholders, with increased autonomy over commercialization. Jorge Rodriguez, who is the president of Venezuela's National Assembly, has expressed optimism about the reform's impact, predicting a positive explosion of oil investment and production. Let's listen in to his comments.
Estamos fervientes y emocionados por lo que acaba de ocurrir en la Asamblea Nacional, pero eso solo pudo ser posible por la fuerza con la que ustedes mantuvieron viva y en alto y produciendo el petróleo a la industria petrolera y de hidrocarburos de Venezuela.
Moreover, following the law's approval, the Trump administration has eased sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry, granting a general license that allows for transactions related to Venezuelan oil exports. This, in turn, opens up new opportunities for US companies to engage with Venezuela's oil sector. Interestingly, the new law also formalises a production sharing model introduced under Maduro, though some critics warn that the deals made in recent years lacked transparency and could lead to corruption. Changes made in the final version of the law included reductions to energy project taxes, though some proposals for more government oversight were rejected. While the reform is seen as a step towards revitalising Venezuela's oil industry, there's still caution regarding the new hydrocarbon tax, which is a provision that has not yet fully been regulated. As Venezuela pushes ahead with its oil industry overhaul, public reactions have been visible on the ground. Pro-government Venezuelans rallied in downtown Caracas in strong support of the recently passed oil reforms. They took to the streets to back changes to the hydrocarbons law that promises to open the country's oil sector to private and to foreign investment. For many here, the rally was not just about policy, but hope that the new legal framework will bring jobs, economic growth and a return to stability after years of decline in production. Let's listen in to their reactions.
Con sanciones, con todo lo que nos han hecho, no hemos descansado y seguiremos luchando, triplicando, trabajando las 8, las 12, las 24 horas si es necesario. Seguiremos trabajando, por eso es que nosotros lucharemos. Esta reforma de hidrocarburos nos ayuda a dignificarnos a nosotros, el motor de la producción.
A través de la nueva ley de hidrocarburos lograremos nuevos ingresos, los cuales serían desarrollados de manera efectiva en el sector salud, el sector educación y el pueblo en general.
With the oil reforms now in motion and public support growing, Venezuela's interim leadership has recently forecasted a surge in foreign investment. Acting President Delcy Rodriguez has claimed that the country expects oil investments to reach about $1.4 billion in 2026, which is a roughly 55% increase compared with last year's levels. Rodriguez told a recent gathering of business leaders that almost $900 million in oil investment came in last year and that $1.4 billion has already been signed for this year. Rodriguez has said Venezuela must go, quote, from the country with the planet's biggest proven reserves of oil to a giant in production in terms. But amid these crucial developments in Venezuela's oil sector, other major global players are also making dramatic moves in the energy market. The Carlyle Group is reportedly set to acquire most of Lukoil's international assets, which is valued at around $22 billion. This acquisition includes oil fields, refineries and fuel stations. However, it's still subject to approval from the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, with a decline for investment set for February the 28th. This purchase is part of Carlyle's major push into energy, following previous investments across both fossil fuels and renewable energy. Notably, Carlyle has made some big moves in the energy space. They've teamed up with the Qatar Investment Authority for a $9.21 billion deal to acquire BASF's coatings business. They have also invested $2 billion in US oil and gas assets, partnering with Diversified Energy. On the renewable front, Carlyle's launched Revera Energy, which is focused on big renewable projects in spaces like Australia and the UK. Carlyle has also made waves in Colombia, becoming the largest independent oil producer in the country with their acquisition of Sierra Coal. As Venezuela opens its doors to foreign investment and private players like Carlyle make bold moves, the energy landscape is undergoing a major transformation. With Venezuela's vast oil reserves now primed for international collaboration and investment, the global energy market is at a pivotal moment, which is balancing traditional energy with renewable innovations. This shift not only marks a new chapter for Venezuela, but signals a classical redefinition of how energy will be produced, managed and invested in the years to come. Safe to say the future of global energy is being shaped right now, with Venezuela positioned as its core. Well, that's all that we have time for this episode. Stay tuned as we bring you more in-depth insights and stories that matter.